The dress didn't fit. It was someone else's dress for someone else's life, ivory silk with pearl buttons that dug into Ivy Wilson's spine like small, deliberate punishments. She stood in front of a cracked bathroom mirror in a motel she'd never been to before, in a town she barely knew, staring at a reflection that didn't feel like hers. In 18 minutes, a car was coming for her. In 18 minutes, she was going to be driven to a mansion she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met, to settle a debt she had never agreed to owe. She pressed her palms flat against the cold edge of the sink and made herself breathe. Her name was Ivy Wilson. And if you were keeping score, and life certainly seemed to be, she was, without question, the unluckiest girl in the world. It hadn't always felt that way. When she was very small, she used to believe that luck was something you earned, like good grades or clean dishes. Her grandmother had told her that once, sitting on the back porch of a house that no longer existed, shelling peas into a ceramic bowl, work hard, stay honest, and the world will meet you halfway. Ivy had believed that with her whole heart for a very long time. Then the world showed her what it actually thought of honest girls. Her mother had died 3 days after Ivy was born. Not in the way stories usually told it, no two last words, who came out in tal way to tell their young father that his wife wasn't come fuck once come, wasn't comin' home, wasn't come home, was old sound come home, once'n't come home. Ivy never got to know the woman whose eyes she apparently inherit. She only knew her through photographs, a slender woman with auburn hair and a laugh that seemed to take up the whole frame, like she couldn't quite contain herself. Her father, Robert Wilson, had loved that woman with everything he had, and when she died, it was as if someone had reached into his chest and taken the part of him that knew how to function. He didn't stop being her father, exactly. He fed her, clothed her, got her to school most mornings. But there was always a glass nearby. Always that particular stillness in his eyes that Ivy learned, very young, meant he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere she couldn't follow. She raised herself, mostly learned to cook at 9, learned to manage the household budget at 12, learned to smile at parent-teacher evenings so that no one asked too many questions. She was a good student, a quiet girl, the kind of person teachers described as mature for her age, which was just a polite way of saying that she'd been forced to grow up before she was ready. She had plans. Small ones, careful ones, a nursing degree, a one-bedroom apartment, a life that was entirely unapologetically hers. She had even saved enough for the first semester's tuition, kept it in a plain white envelope in the back of her underwear drawer. Like it was something sacred, she should have known better than to count on it. 3 weeks ago, a man in a grey suit had knocked on the door of their apartment. Not the landlord, not a neighbour, a lawyer. He had sat down at their kitchen table with a briefcase and a folder and a look on his face that people only got when they were delivering news they'd already made peace with delivering. Robert Wilson had a $20,000 dog. She only lilo dod, had uttered a short, disbelieving sound that she immediately BD regarded, because the man didn't do buck. Loans taken out over the course of 7 years, borrowed from a private firm owned by one Colleen. Interest compounded quarterly, collateral, the apartment, the car, every modest asset Robert Wilson had ever put his name to. Ivy had looked at her father across the table. He couldn't meet her eyes. She'd asked him very quietly where all the money had gone. He told her it was complicated. She asked again. Poker, mostly. Some of it sports betting. A few investments that had gone spectacularly wrong. He said it the way someone confesses to forgetting to take out the trash, sheepish, apologetic, but fundamentally unbothered by the weight of it. Ivy had sat with that for a very long time. The second knock came. Not from the lawyer this time. From a different man entirely, older, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that powerful people developed when they no longer needed to perform authority. He introduced himself as a representative of Damien Cole. He said that Mr. Cole was a practical man, that he had no particular interest in destroying a family over a gambling debt, that there was, however, an arrangement being proposed. Damien Cole was 53 years old. He had been a widower for 6 years. He was, the representative explained with careful neutrality, looking for a wife. Not for love, not for companionship, particularly for structure, for the kind of domestic stability that made certain business negotiations easier, for someone who would occupy the role quietly and competently. The debt would be cleared in full. Robert Wilson would face no legal action. The apartment would remain in the family's name. All that was required was Ivy. She remembered the silence that followed, the clock on the kitchen wall, the sound of her father's breathing, and then, slowly, like a man who had already decided before she had even been given the choice, Robert Wilson had nodded. She had wanted to scream until the windows cracked. She had wanted to look at her father, really look at him and ask him what exactly he thought she was worth. Instead, she had said, "Give me a week to think about it." She spent that week looking for turnovers. She called lawyers, social services, anyone who might have an answer she had thought of. She looked for work that paid enough to make a dent, and found nothing. She looked for the white envelope in her underwear drawer, and found it empty. Her father had taken the tuition money too. He was gone by the time she discovered it. A note on the counter, "I am sorry, Ivy, I couldn't face it, I love you, nothing else, no address, no phone number." Just an apology written in the handwriting of a man who had spent 20 years choosing himself and calling it love. So here she was, in an ivory dress that didn't fit in a motel bathroom, waiting for a car. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like someone walking into a situation they had already decided to survive. That would have to be enough. The car that arrived was a black Mercedes, not ostentatious, just deeply, quietly expensive in the way that only truly old money managed. The driver didn't speak. He held the door, kept his eyes forward, and navigated the morning traffic with the calm efficiency of someone who had made this drive before. Heavy way to suburbs, and the suburbs give way to something else entirely. Wide roads lined with oak trees, gated driveways set back from the street, the occasional flash of a manicured lawn so green it looked feffish oil. This was a different world she had known existed, the way Edwin knew about things that had nothing to do with their own life. But knowing and seeing were two entirely different experiences. The Cole estate appeared at the end of a private road like something out of a film. It wasn't the largest house she could have imagined, but it had the kind of scale that declared itself without effort. 3 stories of pale stone, black-framed windows, a facade that was formal without being cold. Iron gates swung open as the car approached. The driveway was lined with white gravel that crunched beneath the tires, like it was announcing their arrival. Ivy's hands were folded in her lap. She did not let them shake. The car stopped. The driver came around and opened her door. She stepped out onto the gravel and stood in front of the entrance of a house that was apparently, as of today, her home. She looked up at the front door. It opened before she could knock. The man who appeared in the doorway was not 53 years old. He was, at a rough estimate, somewhere around 25. Tall, noticeably tall, with dark hair that was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hand through it. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the kind of face that would have been classically handsome if it weren't currently wearing an expression of such thorough confusion. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ted, you must be the woman my father is marrying." And there it was, not the billionaire. The billionaire's son. Evie stood on that gravel driveway and stared at Ethan Cole for 3 full seconds before she found her voice. "Yes," she said, because what else was there to say? Ethan Cole stepped back and let her inside. He didn't offer to take her bag. He didn't smile. He looked at her with those grey eyes, the way someone looks at a problem they haven't yet decided how to solve, carefully without giving anything away. The entrance hall was exactly what she'd expected from the exterior: high ceilings, dark wood floors, a staircase that curved upward with quiet confidence. There were fresh flowers on a side table that someone had clearly arranged that morning. The whole house smelled faintly of cedar and something clean she couldn't name. "My father is in his study," Ethan said. "I'll take you." He walked ahead of her without checking if she was following. She followed anyway. "Now, before we go any further, if you are watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, now is genuinely the time, because this story is only getting more complicated from here. Ivy is about to walk into that study, and what she finds is going to change everything she thought she understood about this arrangement. Hit subscribe, drop a like if you are already invested, and let us know in the comments. Do you trust Ethan, or do you think he is hiding something? Now, back to Ivy. Damien Cole was not what she had pictured either. She had imagined someone hard, cold, visibly ruthless, the kind of man whose will expressed itself as cruelty. Instead, she found a trim, silver-haired man seated behind a mahogany desk, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, papers spread in front of him. He looked up when they entered, and his expression was composed, professionally pleasant. The expression of someone who had learned to put people at ease as a calculated skill. "Ivy," he said, as if they were resuming a conversation. "Please sit down." She sat. Ethan remained standing near the door. She was acutely aware of him behind her. Damien folded his hands on the desk. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "This is not a conventional arrangement. I am not going to pretend otherwise. You are here because it benefits both our stability that my current situation of Vax. I have no intention of making your life difficult." Something moved behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or the faint flicker of recalibration that happened when a person turned out to be different from what you'd prepared for. "Presence," he said. "You'll be present at dinners, at certain social functions. You'll manage the household staff. You'll carry the name. In return, you'll have every financial comfort this house can provide. Your own accounts, your own schedule within reason." Favy was quad for to Makalope. She thought about Thafik Dakashatavak. Sat, as far as my fidi, we was for a moment. She thought about the note on the kitchen counter. "Fine," she said. Damien nodded, satisfied, and began to reach for a folder. It was the gesture of a man closing a transaction. Ivy stood one condition. He looked up. "I need to understand the boundaries of this arrangement clearly. In writing, what is expected of me and what is not." She paused. "I will not be surprised twice." There was a beat of absolute silence in the room. Damien Cole for the first time smiled, not warmly, exactly, but with something that looked almost like respect. He said, "We'll get along fine." She was shown to her rooms on the second floor by a housekeeper named Marguerite, a woman in her face with quick eyes and a no-dorm senses, fifancy that Ivy immediately like. The rooms were beautiful. A sitting room, a bedroom with a window that looked out over the back gardens, a bathroom with fixtures that cost more than a month of her old rent. Everything was tasteful and impersonal, like a very good hotel. Margaret left her to settle in. Ivy stood in the center of that room and looked around at a life that was technically hers now. Single bag into a wardrobe, built for someone with concessions, a few changes of fur clothes said. Textbooks, she brought them out of hobby, or but photograph of mother in a small land frame, which she placed on table. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full weight of where she was and how she'd gotten here. 60 seconds. That was all she'd allow. She'd always had a rule about that. Grief, fear, panic, they each got a minute. Then you stood up and you figured out what to do next. Her grandmother's voice again, patient and firm. "You don't have the luxury of falling apart, sweetheart. So you don't." She stood up. The first thing she was going to do was learn this house. The Cole estate was larger on the inside than it looked from the outside, which seemed slightly impossible, but was nonetheless true. 6 bedrooms, 3 reception rooms. A library that she nearly walked past before stopping and backtracking, because a wall of books was, regardless of circumstances, something she could not ignore. She was standing in the library, running her fingers along the spines, when Ethan found her. "You'll read?" he asked from the doorway. She turned. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, that same measuring expression on his face. "Is that a genuine question?" she said. "Or are you surprised?" He blinked. Surprised, maybe. Why, he didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the driveway, assessing, careful. Then he pushed off the doorframe and came into the room, pulling a book from a low shelf with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "Because," he said, "most of the women my father has brought into this house over the past 6 years haven't been particularly interested in the library. Ivy filed that away. Ivy filed that away. There have been others." He set the book down on the reading table without opening it. "None of them lasted past the first month. My father is not an easy man to live with." He seemed reasonable enough this morning. He's always reasonable in the morning. Ethan looked at her. "It is the evenings that are the problem." She held his gaze. "Are you trying to scare me off?" "I am trying," he said slowly, "to figure out whether you are actually going to stay. I gave my word. To a man who bought you." The words landed flat and deliberate, like stones dropped in still water. Ivy felt the ripple of them move through her, but didn't let it show on her face. She'd had 23 years of practice keeping her face still. "My father created a debt," she said. "I am settling it. That is all this is." Ethan watched her for a long moment. "Right," he said finally, and picked up the book again. "Dinner's at 7. My father doesn't like waiting." He left. She turned back to the shelves. Her heart was beating faster than she'd like. Dinner was formal in a way that felt slightly theatrical. The dining table was long enough to seat 12 and set for 3, which meant Ivy was flanked by both Cole men with a stretch of polished mahogany between them. Damien sat at the head and directed the conversation with practiced ease. Business, local matters, mild observations about the world that revealed nothing particularly personal. Ivy listened, answered when addressed, and tried to read the room. Ethan was quiet in a way that was different from his father's quiet. Damien's silence was strategic, the silence of someone who knew when to speak for maximum effect. Ethan's was more like suppressed energy, like a sentence he'd started and then thought better of. After on, huffy with the directness, she was beginning work out. "What do you like touristic? What at him carefully? Cast at him carefully, looked at him careful. Is that an offer? Consider it an investment in keeping you occupied productively." He said it without warmth, but also without unkindness. A discontented wife is a liability. An engaged one is an asset. If you want to complete your degree, the finances are not an obstacle. Ivy sat with that for a moment. She had expected a cage. This didn't feel entirely like a cage. "I'll heed her. I'll think about it," she said. He at her from across the table. When she glanced at him, he dropped his gaze to his wine glass. The first 2 weeks passed in a rotter she hadn't anticipated. Structured, almost Curacao, almost Carl Dammer left early and returned late, the way men of his particular variety of Amberson always did. The household staff were efficient, and after a few days cautiously warm toward her. Her particular seemed to have decided she approved, which Ivy understood was the most important approval to have. She explored the estate. She restarted her nursing coursework through an online program. Damien had arranged it without her asking again, which she noted with the kind of careful gratitude she was still learning to navigate. She had 3 conversations of consequence with her new husband, all of them businesslike, all of them revealing a man who was precise and controlled, and probably, underneath all of that, profoundly lonely in a way she doubted he would ever acknowledge. And she and Ethan circled each other. There was no other way to describe it. He was around, working from a home office on the ground floor, taking calls in the garden, disappearing in the late afternoons and reappearing at dinner. He wasn't cold to her, exactly. He wasn't warm either. He was watchful, and she found herself being watchful back, and somewhere in that mutual observation a kind of language was developing that neither of them had formally agreed to speak. He brought her coffee in the library one morning without being asked. She started leaving the door open when she studied in there, which was, she admitted to herself at some point, a kind of invitation. They talked about the books, then about other things. He'd studied architecture, she discovered, and had strong opinions about brutalism that she found disproportionately entertaining. She'd grown up in a tiny apartment, she told him, though not all of the reason why, and had always found spaces fascinating for what they said about the people who built them. "What does this house say about your father?" she asked one afternoon. Ethan looked up from his own book. Outside the library windows the light was going gold and soft. "That he wants people to feel the weight of what he has built," he said, without him having to explain it. "Is that admiration or criticism?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "Both," he said finally. "He earned everything here. I am not sure he knows what to do with it now that he has it." Ivy looked at him. "Do you?" He met her eyes. Something passed between them that she didn't have a name for yet, but could feel in her sternum, like a note played on a string. "Ask me again in a year," he said quietly. It was on the 17th day that things began to come apart. Evie was coming down the main staircase, heading for the kitchen, when she heard voices in the hallway below. Damien's voice and another she didn't recognize, deeper, rougher, with the particular edge of a man who was used to making threats sound like requests. She stopped on the landing and listened. The stranger was talking about a deal, something about a transfer that hadn't cleared, a timeline that had been moved without consent, expectations that were not being met. Damien's responses were level, controlled, but there was a tension in his voice she hadn't heard before, like a structure under more load than it was built for. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to know that whatever clean picture of stability Damien Cole had presented to her, there were things happening underneath it that she had not been told. She went back upstairs. She sat on her bed for a long time, thinking. Then she got up and went to find Ethan. He was in his office. She knocked. He said, "Come in," and she did. She closed the door behind her. He looked up from his computer screen and immediately registered her expression. He leaned back in his chair. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly. She sat. "Your father is in trouble," she said. Ethan was very still. "What makes you say that?" She told him what she'd heard. She didn't dramatize it, just the facts, the tone, the words she'd caught. When she finished, Ethan sat forward, both elbows on the desk, and pressed his fingers against his mouth. He looked like a man holding something in by force. "How much did he tell you?" Ethan said slowly. "About why he needed a wife." "Stability," she said. "Social functions, managing the household." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Right," he opened them. "And none of that is untrue, but it is also not complete." She waited. "My father is in the middle of a business restructuring," Ethan said. "A significant one. There are partners involved, old money, conservative, the kind of people who put enormous weight on personal optics. His last 2 years as a widower have started to concern them. A stable, respectable domestic situation shores up confidence. It is doation, shores up confidence. It is topped. It is transactional, Ivy, more so than he told you." She absorbed that. "So I am not just a wife, I am a business strategy. You are a solution to a perception problem." He looked at her steadily. "I am sorry, you deserved to know that." She appreciated the apology, but what struck her more was the fact that he'd said it at all, that he'd chosen honesty when evasion would have been far easier. "How serious is the trouble?" she asked. "I don't know the full extent of it," he paused. "But I am going to find out." He found out 3 days later. Ivy was in the library when she heard it. Not a conversation this time, but an argument. Real, unguarded, the kind that couldn't be contained by closed doors and stone walls when it had been held in too long. Damien's voice, and Ethan's. She should have stayed where she was. She didn't. She moved to the hallway and stood outside the study door, and she heard everything. Ethan had clearly discovered more than he'd expected. The debt restructuring was not just a business matter. It involved pledged assets, personal guarantees, and a timeline that was now critically compressed. The men Damien was dealing with were not simply investors. They were the kind of people who treated agreements like obligations in the most literal sense of the word. And then she heard her own name. "She doesn't know what she walked into," Ethan said, his voice hard and controlled and furious, in the way of someone who had run out of patience for careful words. "She thought she was settling her father's debt." You turned her into a prop for a business negotiation she had no knowledge of. She has everything she was promised, Damien said. She was promised an arrangement, not this. Ethan, she has a right to know what she is actually part of. A silence, long waited. She signed the certificate, Damien said finally. The arrangement holds. The arrangement, Ethan said, very quietly, was made with incomplete information. That is not an arrangement. That is a trap. Fee stood in the hallway and felt the word land in her chest trap. She had known it on some level. She had packed it away under discipline and routine and the deliberate occupation of her days. But hearing it said out loud, hearing someone else say it, was a different thing entirely. She went back to her room. She sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the garden, where the evening light was doing something beautiful with the oak trees that she couldn't fully appreciate right now. She thought about the nursing textbooks on the desk, the library with the door left open, coffee she hadn't asked for, an honest conversation in an office with the door closed. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd said, "Ask me again in a year." She thought about what she was going to do. At 10 o'clock that night, she began to pack her bag, not frantically, not in tears. With the same quiet, methodical efficiency she'd developed as a child, packing lunches and managing budgets, and learning not to take up more space than necessary. She folded her clothes, tucked her nursing textbooks under her arm, picked up the small wooden frame with her mother's photograph. She didn't have a plan beyond the next 12 hours. She would find a motel. She would call the one friend, Clara, from her nursing program, who would take a call at this hour without asking too many questions. She would figure out the rest from there. She had survived worse starting points. She picked up her bag. She crossed to the bedroom door. She opened it. Ethan was standing in the hallway. He looked at the bag. He looked at the photograph in her hand. He looked at her face with those grey eyes that had been watching her carefully and honestly since the very first morning on the gravel driveway. He didn't say, "You can't leave." He didn't reach for the bag. He didn't try to block the door. What he said was, "Where will you go?" Ivy lifted her chin. "Somewhere that is mine." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that." He leaned against the wall beside the door, not blocking, just present. "I am not here to stop you. I want you to know that." She studied him. "Then why are you here?" He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, the careful composure was entirely gone. He just looked like a person, complicated and tired and honest. "Because I told my father tonight that what he did was wrong," he said, "and I meant it, and I also—" He stopped, started again. "I think you are one of the most capable people I've ever met, and I think this situation has been profoundly unfair to you, and I think if you walk out of this house tonight, you'll be fine, because you are clearly always fine, and I think—" He stopped again. Ivy waited. "I think I don't want you to go," he said simply, "and you deserve to know that, not as a reason to stay, just as a true thing." The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere below them, a clock ticked. Ivy looked at Ethan Cole, this man she had not expected, in a house she had not chosen, in a life she had not planned. She thought about the white envelope, her father's handwriting, the dress that didn't fit. She thought about a library with the door left open. She set the bag down, not because she was surrendering, not because she had run out of options, or because the house was beautiful, or because Damien's lawyers held something over her. She set the bag down because she was, for the first time in a very long time, making a choice that was entirely and completely hers. "I am not staying for him," she said. "I know," Ethan said, "and this isn't. I am not saying this is anything. I know that too." She looked at him for another long moment. "I am going to need very different terms." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I'll draw up the paperwork myself," he said. The next morning, Ivy sat across from Damien Cole in the same study where he had first outlined his conditions to her. The arrangement he described, the transaction, the optics, the solution to a perception problem, was different from what she'd agreed to, and both of them knew it. She had spent the early hours of the morning writing clearly, in her own words, the terms under which she was willing to continue. She placed the document on the desk in front of him. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "You drafted this yourself?" he asked. "Last night," she said. He looked up. For just a moment, behind the controlled surface, she saw something she hadn't seen there before, something that might have been, in a man less armored, admiration. "You know," he said, "you remind me of someone." She said nothing. She waited. "My wife," he said. She didn't let me get away with anything either. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't expected one, but it was something, the first genuine thing he had offered her, the first crack in the professional surface, a glimpse of the actual person behind the transaction. She reached across the desk and took the document back. She added one line, in her neat handwriting, "This agreement supersedes all prior understandings and is entered into freely and with full information." She slid it back to him. He read the line. He picked up a pen. He signed. The days that followed were different. Not easier, exactly. The business complications Damien was navigating didn't resolve overnight, and Ivy was still learning to inhabit a life that felt like it had been built for someone else, but different in the way that honesty always made things different, harder in some moments, cleaner in others, truer throughout. Damien, she was learning, was a man who respected people who didn't flinch from him. He had spent decades surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, and somewhere along the line he had confused that arrangement for comfort, when what it had actually done was leave him profoundly alone. He wasn't easy, he might never be, but he was real, in the way that all difficult people were more real than the agreeable ones. She began attending some of the business meetings, not as a decoration, she'd made that clear, but as herself, quietly absorbing the language of a world she'd never had access to. Sharp and Damien noticed, and occasionally she would catch him watching her across a conference table with that same expression of careful recalibration she'd seen. On the first day, she enrolled in the first day, she enrolled in the Sing program properly full-time, with the university fees handled by a bank transfer, that replied without ceremony. She studied in the library, door open, and didn't think too hard about what that signified. Ethan was around. They didn't talk about the hallway. They didn't need to. It existed between them as a known thing, solid and quiet, like a foundation that didn't need to announce itself. He brought her coffee. She notes in the books she returned to the library shelves, and he read them. She knew because she would sometimes find responses in Halskelth characteristically. Fere altri dus faltus simple. He had his own complicated relationship with his father, with the weight of the coal name, with the architecture firm he ran that was undeniably brilliant, and that Damien undeniably underestimated. He had walls of his own, different from his father's, but just as real. She wasn't pretending otherwise, but they were built facing each other. That was the thing. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, they had started it with honesty in a hallway at 10 o'clock at night, and that was a better foundation than most things got. 6 weeks after she arrived, there was a formal dinner. Damien's business partners, the conservative optics-focused men whose confidence he was trying to shore up, were gathered in the dining room with their wives and their careful expressions, and Ivy sat at the table as Damien Cole's wife, and played the role she had agreed to play. She was good at it. She was warm without being effusive, composed without being cold. She asked questions that showed she had done her research, made connections that landed well, held the room in the way she had learned to hold rooms since she was 9 years old, and managing situations that were too large for a child. Across the table, Ethan watched her, not the way he'd watched her in the beginning, not assessing, not trying to figure out what she was. Just watching the way you watch something you had already, without entirely meaning to, begun to care about. After the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet again, she was standing in the entrance hall, pulling off the earrings she'd borrowed from the jewellery box Damien had placed in her dressing room when she heard footsteps behind her. She looked up in the hallway mirror and found Ethan's reflection there. "You were remarkable," he said quietly. She turned around. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had not wanted her to go, who had drawn up terms on her behalf, who read her margin notes and left answers in pencil. "Ethan," she said, "what is this?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He took one careful step forward, watching her face. "I think," he said slowly, "it is the most honest thing I've been part of in a very long time." Ivy thought about her grandmother on the back porch. Work hard, stay honest, and the world will meet you halfway. She had stopped believing that for a while. She wasn't sure when she'd started again. "I am still figuring out my life," she told him. "I know this house isn't. I mean, I am still deciding what this is. I know that too." He was close enough now that she could see the sincerity in his face, unguarded and clear. "I am not asking you to decide anything. I am just standing here." Ivy Wilson looked at Ethan Cole, a man she had never been supposed to meet, in a house she had never been supposed to want to stay in, on the other side of the worst few months of her life. She had come here in a dress that didn't fit. She was starting to think she was building something that did. She reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket once with steady hands. "Ask me again," she said, and Ethan Cole, for the first time since she had known him, smiled with his whole face. Outside the tall windows of the Coley Stout, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the small, careful lutions happening inside people's lives. Tomorrow Damien would face another meeting, another negotiation, another version of the tightrope he had been walking for longer than he cared to admit. Ivy would open her nursing textbooks in the library with the door open. Ethan would leave a note in pencil in the margins of something she hadn't yet read. And Ivy Wilson, the most unlucky girl in the world, according to anyone keeping score, would sit in a house that had started as a transaction and was becoming, slowly and honestly, something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. She was not the same girl who had stood in that motel bathroom 18 days ago. She was not, perhaps, entirely herself yet. That would take longer and more work, and the particular kind of patience she had always been better at than she'd given herself credit for. But she was here, she had chosen to be here, and that, after everything, was a kind of luck all its own, the kind that didn't ask you to be grateful for the disaster that preceded it, the kind that simply arrived quiet and solid in the middle of everything you had survived, the kind, Ivy thought, that was finally unmistakably hers.